We're joined now to discuss with the former Chief of Staff to Vice President Mike Pence, Marc Short. Marc, good to see you. You testified in front of the grand jury. What is your reaction as a former member of the Trump administration, as a Republican, as an American, to seeing Donald Trump arrested and arraigned today for his attempts to overturn the election?
Well, Jake, thanks for having me. I think that January 6th was a tragic day for our country, and I think today is an incredibly sad day. I don't think any of us would cherish seeing a president indicted and arraigned. And, I think that the events of January 6th, I don't know to what extent there's evidence for criminality, but I do think that Donald Trump was wrong. He was foundationally wrong about suggesting that the vice president should throw out his oath to the Constitution, and I think that as well the president clearly was derelict in his duty on that day and the days leading up to it.
Your former boss, the former Vice President Mike Pence, he fought having to testify, but ultimately he did, ordered to do so. He is repeatedly cited in the indictment. Would he testify at trial if called to do so?
I think that, the vice president has always complied with the law, and I think that he would in that case. I think hypothetically, don't know if we'll get to that point yet, Jake, but I think even in the first case, he did fight grounds on separation of powers, and I think he won a round from in that, but ultimately where there was parts that he was compelled to testify, he complied with that subpoena.
Obviously, the vice president took a lot of contemporaneous notes. He used them when he wrote his memoir that came out last year. Yeah. They also play a role in this indictment. Were you and was the vice president, Mr. Pence, were you expecting his testimony to play as important a role as it did in the indictment?
I think obviously he was the central figure in this, so I think we expected it. To what extent, wouldn't know. I think that the role of Vice President of the United States is it contains a lot of heavy responsibilities from national security to domestic policy to managing a COVID task force. And so he did take contemporaneous notes. But as you say, most of that I think was already reflected in his book. I don't think there was that much new. But I do think what's different is at this point, I think the prosecution probably has testimony from people around the president himself, from the campaign, who testified that there was not evidence of fraud that would have had a material difference to the election result. Or they've had people testify from the White House counsel's office who said, the vice president has no such magical authority to overturn the election, nor do we want Kamala Harris to have that authority in 2024. And, I think one name that's obviously not in the indictment is Mark Meadows, who was kind of the ringleader of all of this. And I think presumably there's a lot of testimony from him as well. And so I think a lot of those things are probably in the prosecution's hands as well.
So you think, you don't know for a fact, but you think that Mark Meadows cooperated and did testify?
Well, I don't know. I don't know, Jake, but I would imagine that certainly if you look at the list of co-conspirators, Mark was the ringleader bringing the various lawyers in who had random theories about what the vice president could do, organized most of those meetings, organized the meetings with members of Congress, and so was a leader in much of those efforts that the president pursued in trying to convince the vice president of this magical authority. And so the fact that he's not mentioned, I think, would lead one to say, well, in light of so many of the other co-conspirators, there must be some level of testimony that they have from Mark.
One of the interesting pieces of evidence in the indictment is Donald Trump telling your former boss, or your boss, Vice President Pence, that he's too honest when he is refusing to go along with this scheme to send the results back to the states and overturn the election and subvert the will of the American people. Too honest. I saw on social media today that the vice president's campaign for president is using that in some campaign swag. Too honest on a shirt, too honest on a mug. Do you think, beyond being a clever swag, kudos on that, but do you think that that proves that Donald Trump knew that it was all a lie?
I don't know if it proves that, Jake. As I said from the start, I don't know the evidence of criminality here, but I do know that the president was wrong in pursuing this legal notion. I do know that he was wrong in trying to pressure the vice president to do something beyond his constitutional authority that had been explained to the president. To the extent to which, again, he had been informed of his defeat or the failure of the legal efforts, I think there's campaign testimony to that effect, and they'd probably have better evidence of what the president's state of mind was of that. And it'd be wrong for me to try to have that conjecture, but I think the evidence would certainly stack up to suggest that he was at least informed of that.
What do you think too honest means, though?
Well, I think that as I interpreted in the moment, it was that the former vice president was saying, this is what my constitutional limitations are, and that's what I'm going to pursue. And, you know, I think there's some of this notion out there you're hearing from the president's defense counsel that they just wanted the vice president to return it to the states, which, of course, the vice president has no such authority to do, and nor has any vice president for 50 years. But I think it's important, Jake, to know that the request was for the vice president to simply unilaterally dismiss the electors. And the prosecution has notes from the president's senior advisor who said, look, since Pence isn't willing to go along with that, perhaps we could pivot to this other plan.
Oh, okay.
And that plan was pushed in the last 36 hours. But even that obviously was unconstitutional, and no one would say Kamala Harris should have that ability to choose which Republican states you send back to states in 2024.
Yeah, I'm sure Al Gore would have liked to have had that power back in January 2001. Marc, sure, good to see you. Thank you so much.